Lloyd, our local trustees, Martha Dennison, Barbara Romanelli, and Sam Correa, who organized this event, will help me to moderate this evening. We plan to be here 1.25 hours to 6:45, so that you can also attend the ballot question informational session at 7 p.m. at the Senior Center. As you know, we have pizza in the back. Please help yourselves if you have not already. This event will be recorded on Zoom. It will be available on the library website and social media. With me are our special panelists, Betsy Sullivan, Donna Wood, and Jack Rubin. And of course, our two candidates, Becky, Coletta, and Ken Sweezey. I'm going to introduce our panelists first. And then our candidates will introduce themselves through their answers to questions. Jack Rubin is a senior at Duxbury High School and current class president. He's also the state president of the Massachusetts Association of Student Councils. He's captain of the cross-country, indoor and outdoor track teams, and he's the principal trumpet in the wind ensemble. And congratulations to Jack. Donna Wood grew up in Duxbury and has been a real estate agent for 5 decades. He and her partner started McDonald and Wood Real Estate, now South Shore Sotheby's, where Donna is an agent. She's the current president of the Duxbury Rural and Historical Society. She also formed the Duxbury Community Collaborative, 16 nonprofit groups who focus on history, culture, or education. Betsy Sullivan has been a resident of Duxbury for 39 years and has had a career in banking for 35 of those. She has served as a school committee member, as a member of the select board, and has been on the finance committee for over 10 years. Now, for the forum. The format will be this. Each panelist will ask a question and each candidate will have 2 minutes to reply. I will be the timekeeper, and while I will hold up a card at 1.5 minutes, saying 30 seconds or less for the candidates to reply. We have 12 questions. Jack will start us off with the first question. In alphabetical order, Becky Coletta will get the first question first. After that, the candidates take turns answering first. Since this is a forum and not a debate, there will be no added time for rebuttals. Lastly, at the end of the forum, you will be able to, all of you will be able to speak with candidates individually if you have follow-up questions. So, great, let's get started. Jack, the first question is yours to Becky Coletta.
Wonderful. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your life and job experience to date? Why are you running to be our state rep? And perhaps more importantly, why should people vote for you? Thanks.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks to everybody who's put this on. A lot of people were involved. It's nice to see so many people in the room. I will try to talk without coughing because I have a little bit of a throat thing. But I have no microphone, so I will try to be loud. So I'm running because this is a district I have lived, worked, and raised a family in for the last 21 years. I love this district, and I really want to go to the State House and try to make sure that we strengthen our community with assistance from the state. And we help the constituents of this district access services at the state and bring back resources to all of our towns. First and foremost, I'm a mom. I have a senior in high school. And I do a lot of this for him and to make sure that he's going to have a better future. I've done a lot of community work over the years. I first moved to Hanson in 2003 and jumped right in, helped to form the Whitman-Hanson Community Access Corp, ran for the select board. After my son was born, we moved to Pembroke. I served 2 terms or most of 2 terms on the planning board before I ran for select board and served a term on the select board Then I went to work at the State House for Josh in the Committee for Labor and Workforce Development. I took a leave from that position to run for this office. I've also volunteered a lot. Hanson Kiwanis, 20 years, 10 years on the Human Rights Committee of Road to Responsibility. And my professional career, I'll have to leave for another day because it turns out I only have 30 seconds left. Coastal engineering, satellite communications, business attorney for 34 years. I'm running so that I can stand up for reproductive rights, so that I can stand up and bring back resources for our coastline and our environmental issues, and so that we can really address some of the healthcare issues in our region and make sure that we have the services we need. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Jack. Thanks for the question. Thank you to all the panelists, our host. Again, I'll just echo the sentiments. Awesome that the library could pull this together. The trustees, Martha, Les, thank you, everybody. And thank you, everybody, for attending. As I mentioned to a few people, it's always great when both of us can be in the room and talk about the issues. And I think the more informed voters we have in November, the better for the district. So my name is Ken Sweezey. I grew up in this district. I grew up over in Hanson. I currently live in Pembroke. Spent a lot of my time, as mentioned, playing ball over at Botieri, going through Hanson schools up until high school when I went to Boston College High School. After that, I went on to Loyola University, Chicago to get my undergraduate degree in forensic science. Throughout college and high school, I was back in the district. I was working for my family's local small business, Sweezey Fence, that is located over in Whitman, Massachusetts, that my grandfather started out of his garage in 1969 when he returned from Vietnam. So we have some really, really deep roots here and care deeply about the South Shore. After obtaining my degree, I went on to the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department as a civilian forensic scientist. I worked there for over 4 years, just about 4 years, excuse me, working on, unfortunately, about over 200 homicides, assaults, 200 robberies, 1,000+ property crimes. Just saw a side of life and a side of the world that really needs addressed at a system level as well. And really talking about inspiration for running, that's really where it came from. I was with the police department when COVID first happened, experiencing the lockdowns, and everywhere crime was skyrocketing. I really recognized that there was something that needed to be done more at a system level. For every, perpetrators were getting more numerous and unfortunately younger as time goes on. So for every case we solved, there was 2 more in its place. And I think a system level is the best way to do that. So I now work in the private sector. I moved back in 21 and worked with the Economic Development and Capital Improvement Committee in the town of Hanson before moving to Pembroke. And like I said, was working in the private sector throughout that time in the biotech space, which is obviously a big booming industry here in Massachusetts. So look forward to talking about the issues tonight.
Living in a coastal community, many residents are concerned about the effects of rising waters in our town. What's your position on how the state should coordinate efforts to manage coastal resiliency and offset the impacts of the climate crisis? Ken?
Yeah, thank you. That's obviously over here a very, very important question on the top of all of our minds. Coastal resiliency is going to become probably the biggest issue of our time. As we move further into the future with rising sea levels here, a massive cost goes on to the towns for beach nourishment and things of that nature. It's a really big concern. I think public-private partnerships is going to be a really key part of that. You look at the launch of the Atlantic Resiliency Innovation Institute that's going on over in Marshfield, spearheaded by the Chamber of Commerce and some really interested individuals over there. They're partnering with Northeastern. And right now they were able to afford federal grant money, but as they move into the future, it's going to increasingly need private sector funds to run. And that's sort of the plan. So making sure that we foster those is really, really important. Doing the research, understanding what these lab spaces and these partnerships really need in the public sector. But, the state's going to play a really, really big role in that as well. Of course, the town just really can't absorb large capital costs, whether it's seawall rebuilding or beach nourishment and things like that. And they rely on those grants. So we have to make sure that we have someone up there that's going to advocate for that grant money, obtain earmarks, work across the aisle, have partnerships, and make sure that as much money is coming back to our district generally as possible, but also in this issue that's only going to become a bigger and bigger threat, really hurt our local economies, obviously all the residential areas that's down on the water. And really that barrier beach does more than just create recreation. It does a lot to protect the rest of the town and our inland communities as well, excuse me. So yeah, absolutely going to be a big issue, and the state rep's going to have a really big role to play in that going forward.
So this is one of our key issues going forward, and it's not just here, it's throughout the country. We, in the past, I worked for a coastal engineering firm down in Louisiana. And we also did some post-disaster recovery relief in New York after Hurricane Sandy. And you see that what happens even in the Northeast, when these big storms start to come up our way, I've seen what's happened down there in terms of the need to really bring in some significant amount of funding to avoid the ravages of the coastline. I have an idea of how we do that, and I'd like to see us get back all the resources we can. The seawall money, the $3 million, is just a piece of it. It's also about making sure that the barrier beach survives the storms. It's making sure that our homes survive the storms. But beyond that, we also have to look at the global warming issue overall. And what is our role with respect to climate change? And how do we acknowledge that what's happening on our coastline is not without some ability of ours to impact? And when we looked at things like wind energy and alternative energy sources, so that we can start to be a part of the solution overall, that's an important piece of Massachusetts and what we're doing to resolve the energy crisis going forward.
All set? All right.
I thought he was about to say concept.
No.
I'm finished.
Okay, perfect. Well, we'll start another. Our town voted last spring to appropriate funds for study and mitigation of PFAS in our wells. How will you support our efforts to make the changes necessary to meet the federal mandate of the regulation of PFAS in our drinking water?
So the issue of PFAS in the drinking water is one of these things where we move into technologies that we don't really understand the impact until years later. It's unintended consequences, right? No one knew that PFAS was such an issue years ago. And so part of it is to mitigate the impact by bringing in, Myrna, can you not hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'll try to speak louder. Okay. So part of it is, it's difficult with my voice. With PFAS, it's a funding issue at the beginning, right? How do we get the funds we need to mitigate a problem that exists today with PFAS? But it's also making sure that as we move into new technologies, that we try to avoid this problem happening again. Right now, we're looking at things like the firefighting equipment and trying to make sure that the firefighting equipment doesn't have these types of forever chemicals. But do we know if we're replacing it with something that's going to be better long term? So I think it's following the science to make sure that we can avoid these kind of problems happening in the future, and making sure that we get the money back to the district to help to clean it up now.
Yeah, great. I hate to say it again, but this is also going to be a really big issue going forward, one of the biggest ones environmentally. So the regulation that was being referenced, the federal government, the EPA came out with, the regulation is 4 parts per trillion, which I know that number may not mean anything, but that's how they measure contaminants in the water. As a reference, all 5 of our towns measure over 4 parts per million in multiple different types of PFAS chemicals. Every single town. And actually, Duxbury is the highest. Duxbury has the most contaminated water in the 6th Plymouth. And depending on the town that you're looking at, it's about 6-fold, actually, of some of the other towns. We're somewhere in the range, depending on the chemical, in Duxbury at about 35 parts per trillion with certain ones. Now, the state originally came with a regulation that was 50 parts per trillion. So we need to make sure that we can rectify those two things and what's actually safe, depending on what the regulation is on the federal government, because if that's unfunded, I mean, if you're looking at every well needing filtration, these carbon filtration systems that are needed to get the PFAS out of the water are incredibly expensive. Representative Cutler was able to secure one for that first well in Duxbury that was in the millions of dollars, I believe, for that appropriation. So to say that we're going to have to come up to a 4 part per trillion threshold in all of our wells in all of our towns, obviously that's something that the towns themselves are not going to be able to bear. So that's going to be looking at, we're going to need the advocacy to make sure that our federal delegation, who's going to have to be advocating for these regulations of the 4 parts per trillion, are going to need to make sure that they're able to bring some money back, because we have some of the biggest problems with PFAS here. Yes, making sure causes, we've done a lot of headway here with the firefighting equipment and the foams and everything to make sure that they don't have extra exposure, but the drinking water is really going to be a big problem. So we need to make sure that we tackle this. We see what those root causes are. We make sure that everybody has access to clean water like they need.
Thank you.
Awesome. If elected, will you prioritize educational funding at the state level? Which budgetary elements do you think are most important when it comes to education?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. And I'd say that's particularly important here in Duxbury. For those of you that don't know, the state uses particular funding formulas for regular state aid that comes back. That's education funding, roads, all things like that. So education specifically, Chapter 70 follows a formula that actually has income or your poverty level, whatever it may be for your town, involved in that equation. So for reference, Pembroke, which is a smaller town than Duxbury, is getting $16 million next year in its allotment for Chapter 70. Duxbury is receiving $6 million. That's not a good formula. That is not very equal. That is not very fair that you guys have to bear such a large brunt. So that education funding is really going to hurt the town going forward. When you have to make those hard decisions, when you have administrative costs going up, district-wide, Commonwealth-wide, nationwide, cost per pupil is going up. So what it costs to educate a single student is really going up. Mandates in special education and in transportation are really big costs for town that the state really needs to step in and assist, because when any individual district has to absorb these large costs, as the individual per pupil cost goes up, and as well as in unequal funding formulas persist, it just is sort of a recipe for disaster. And we have a lot of towns in our district, Duxbury included, that in a couple of years could be looking at 2.5 overrides. You're looking at making the tax levy increase to make sure that they can cover those costs. It's something that needs to be scrutinized. And I believe that our rep really needs to fight hard to revise and edit these funding formulas.
So I've been hearing about these funding formulas since I first joined the select board in Hanson back in 2004. And the issue is that when we look at these issues and what the solutions are going to be, we have to think about what we're going to do to be successful in our arguments at the State House. And it's fine to have ideas. It's another thing to get them accomplished. When I look at the funding formula, it sort of pits. What it does is it says, here's the foundation budget of what your town should spend to meet all of the criteria we have for good quality education. And then it applies a formula that says, what can that district afford to pay on its own? And what does the state need to supplement? So that idea tends to favor districts with less money and less income, right? Because the idea is that you fix it across the board so that every kid gets a basic foundation. So as we fight about the formula, I think we've lost some opportunities here. And that's to really go at the foundation budget. The foundation budget is something we ally with everyone in the state on. It doesn't pit city versus town. It says the foundation budget is not keeping up with the mandates. It's not keeping up with the cost of what we really need to do to educate children. So first off, I would try to build alliances and coalitions around increasing the foundation budget before we even get to the formula. And I think that's a successful way to build coalitions. Secondly, I really think that we need to look at special education funding. Our towns are on a Prop 2.5 override system, which means that it's based on sort of having level funding over time. With special education, it can really be lumpy. And I think the only system that's big enough to handle the lumpiness and still give quality services to meet the needs of special kids who deserve special education, it requires you to fund that at a state level where it can handle the lumpiness.
What are your views on the Holtec Pilgrim nuclear power plant decommissioning? And what do you think the state and community should be doing to minimize the impact on our community? Becky?
So Holtec has been difficult, right? Because the Nuclear Regulatory Commission controls a lot of the decommissioning. And so what's happening on the site itself is controlled by the NRC. We've had advocates such as Mary Lampert and Jim who've gone in and said, right now they're talking about dumping radioactive waste into the bay. They've gotten DEP involved to say, okay, that calls into question our own state law on dumping into ocean sanctuaries. And DEP has reached a decision that says you can't dump. But meanwhile, Holtec is still trying to heat up the water and evaporate it. So I think we need to continually put pressure on Holtec to use the money that's been put aside through customer payments that were taken from customers over time to cover the cleanup. And we need them to use that money to clean this up properly, to move that water before it all evaporates, and to comply with the DEP decision. And that's the most important thing. And then we need to put some more pressure on NRC, as people have been doing for years, to better regulate what's happening on site. They're a little harder to get at.
Yeah, this is an issue that my opponent and I are going to agree on. There's been no one who has been working as hard for the last 3 years. I've been volunteering with a lot of beach organizations, really talking to a lot of fishermen, lobstermen, obviously people in the towns, and people from all over the district that enjoy the beaches. Not a single person wants this. Nobody wants them dumping in, and DEP's done a good job of holding their feet to the fire. Now, like my opponent said, they're dragging their feet, trying to evaporate that water. My understanding of that money that was being referenced there is that it's a fixed amount, and basically whatever they spend in order to decommission, they get to keep whatever's left over. So they're obviously trying to keep their cost as low as possible, which dumping it would be a near zero cost, of course. So, but they have that money in order to dispose of that waste properly. And they're being held accountable for that, which is good. So we will continue on my side to put that pressure and enforce that DEP mandate to make sure that they carry that off. There's going to be no dumping in the bay, and making sure they stop dragging their feet and evaporating the water when people have a lot of concerns about the air quality as well.
And when Roe v. Wade was overturned, the Supreme Court sent the issue back to the states to determine what rules should be in place with regard to abortion. Soon thereafter, the governor and the legislature took action to protect patients seeking providers offering abortion care services in the Commonwealth. Did you support the legislature's action in 2021? What role do you think the legislature still has with regard to the issue of abortion access?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been pretty vocal on this as well for the past 3 years. A lot of people have asked this question as it got brought back down to the states, which I agreed with the way that my understanding of the decision, and bringing things back from the federal government to the states in general is a good thing when that authority lays there. But again, I've been pretty vocal about this, done interviews the last 3 years as well about this. I'm a big fan of the way the law is written right now in Massachusetts. I think the legislature and the governor at the time, Charlie Baker, did a really good job of making sure that we're sticking up for women's rights, making sure that they have that autonomy over their body. And the way the law is written right now, up to viability is a very good standard. And I have no problem with the law. I'd make sure that there's no one, I mean, in Massachusetts, this is pretty much a settled issue in the way that there's never going to be any will or majority that's going to take this right away. And I'm glad that I can stand behind that and make sure that we affirm that right as well.
So I did support the Roe Act in 2021. I've been a strong supporter of reproductive rights since I was a student at NYU Law School and organized buses of students to go to DC and fight to protect our rights under Roe v. Wade, which we thought would never go away. And so I no longer accept it when people say these rights are never going away, because I've seen them lost. I think we have to make sure that we continue to protect women's right to choose, women's right to make their own healthcare decisions, throughout their pregnancies. I also think that we need to look in Massachusetts about whether or not we're providing sufficient access to care across the board. There are no abortion providers on the South Shore, anywhere, outside of Boston, or I think down in Foxborough or Attleboro. There are no services. There also are very few reproductive services. We've gotten rid of maternity wards in Taunton, maternity wards in Wareham. And we've really lost a lot of our basic medical care and reproductive care. And we need to make sure that we fully fund healthcare in general in our region, and reproductive care is one piece of that.
Becky, earlier this year, the state passed a new gun law which cracks down on the use of ghost guns, expands the state's red flag law, and bans the carrying of firearms in schools and government buildings, among other provisions. The law is now being challenged in court to be sent back to the legislature. What is your view on this new law? Do you support changes to it?
So last year when I was in the legislature, we were looking at an earlier version, which was pretty similar. And there were some things that I know that Rep. Cutler put in to amend the law to make sure that police officers who are off duty can still take their guns to schools, for example, when they're off duty, because we all know that police officers are frequently called into action even when they're off duty. So that is something, things like that did get fixed in the bill, but I agree with the intent of the bill. It was designed to comply with the Second Amendment ruling. It is designed to really get at ghost guns, at guns around schools, and with training and proper training for people to hold firearms licenses. And I agree with all those basic principles. And so I would continue to fight to have common sense gun legislation. Massachusetts is one of the safest states in the country when it comes to gun violence. It is. And it's no coincidence that we also have some of the strictest gun laws in the country.
So I'm going to disagree here on that one. I'm a gun owner myself. I'm a member of Old Colony Sportsman Association. Gun owners are some of the most law-abiding citizens. They know the law very well. We've listed a few things here, 3 or 4 different aspects. The bill's over 100 pages. So it's far from just attacking 1 or 2 certain things. The training requirements is actually one of the biggest things I have a hard time with because it's really prohibitory. This is making it completely prohibitory for people that are far away. So in Massachusetts, we have no public gun ranges. They're private. So you have to be a member to go there. So the live fire training requirement is very unique. It's very rare in the nation, and it's very prohibitory for people that don't have access to travel, to get to a club, be a member of a club. Member of a club. That training requirement, very prohibitory. So it is not in the intent. The reason it's in court is because it does not come close to adhering to the Bruin decision, which is that Supreme Court decision that my opponent just referenced from 2022. It also does not apply with the Heller decision that happened back in 2006, 2008, somewhere in that area. So all of the recent things that the Supreme Court has come down on the Second Amendment, this law is in violation of. I'm very optimistic that there's going to be a good result in the court. And I would just like to mention the other big thing that's really sticks out to me about this law and the way it's been handled was it was signed at the end of session, at formal session back at the end of July. Not an emergency then when it was signed. And then we had a referendum. That's a big part of this gun debate here. You saw the signs, I'm sure, all over town and all over the South Shore. A lot of people, a lot of legal gun owners and advocates were fighting to get this on the ballot in 2026 and to just suspend the law. And however the voters came out in 26, the law would either go into effect or not. The governor stepped up and did a wholly unnecessary and I would say undemocratic thing by signing this emergency declaration, which immediately put the law into effect when the democratic process was playing out. And that was wrong. Regardless of how you feel about 2A and guns, we should have let it play out. And no matter how the ballot initiative went, it would have played out that way.
Reports show that high housing costs are one of the main factors driving out younger workers. With already tight labor markets, Massachusetts can't afford to lose these workers. What can we do to ease this housing cost crunch? And how can you as a state legislator be an effective voice on this issue?
Absolutely. This is a great question. I'd say after the immigration issue, affordability and housing is probably the other top 2 issue that we're hearing every day. So affordability is wholly important, but affordability is holistic. It's not just housing costs. There's also a reason that we're becoming very uncompetitive in the nation, whether it's in the business environment, whether it's the tax environment, the fact that never mind trying to afford a house, but you can barely insure any homes that are existing now anyways because of some of the really overly burdensome regulation For example, if you repair X number of square footage in your house, you have to get everything up to code. And here in New England, we have plenty of homes that have been around a long, long time, which makes it completely prohibitory to insure these homes. So you have rising cost of insurance as the competition goes down. There's a lot of things to this affordability piece that's just not about the sticker price of your homes, right? I'm a little optimistic, and not everybody agrees on this issue, left or right. I would say I'm a little optimistic about the accessory dwelling units, to be honest, because what this does is it does not provide fuel for developers. It allows you to make an in-law for your elderly parents or let your younger children stay after college, and something of that nature that's more on the individual, doesn't change the character of your town. So I'm hopeful that that dynamic will be able to play out in a positive way, increase stock a little bit in a little bit more organic fashion. But again, affordability is a very holistic issue. So without addressing the overregulation, the overtaxing, and everything that's going on in the Commonwealth that's making us a very uncompetitive state, we're never going to be able to get to the root of the problem.
So when Charlie Baker was governor, he started looking at housing choice and the housing crisis in our state, somewhere around 2015, 2016 with his housing choice initiative. And what he was looking at is that we were losing our competitive edge because businesses were finding it hard to relocate here when their managers and their workers couldn't afford houses. And the estimate at the time was that we needed something like 200,000 new units to change the supply-demand curve. And they came up with deregulation, which was Section 3A or the MBTA Communities Act. And that was an idea about deregulation and let the private market take over and fix the issue without government intervention. You just deregulate by removing some of the zoning restrictions. I don't think that that was a right approach. What I would like to see is that we go back to our towns. There was ideas along the way about housing choices in our communities. And how do we come up with more housing choices? When I was on the planning board, we looked at this several times. We did our own housing production plan in Pembroke. And we said, how do we want to bring housing in? Where do we want to bring it in? How is it going to fit? One of the things we have in our area is almost no rental housing. You know, a lot of times, Donna can tell you that when it comes to do you rent or do you buy, there's not a big choice because there's not a lot of places to rent. So it's not a real option in a lot of our towns around here. And so what I'd like to see someplace here like Duxbury, you have a lot of really good people working on the Affordable Housing Committee. You have the age-friendly communities work that's happening and looking at what is the type of housing that Duxbury wants and needs so that people can live here at all stages. So that you don't need to make $300,000 a year to afford the median house price of $850,000. How do we make it so that young people can still settle here and older people can stay here even when they no longer can care for their homes?
Well, we're gonna piggyback on that. You brought up the MBTA. Duxbury is just about to hold a special town meeting where we will deliberate on a plan to meet the state's requirements under the MBTA Community Act. You've touched on it, but if you could elaborate on your views on the MBTA Communities Act and how you think Duxbury should proceed.
So it's a difficult question as to how to proceed given our current posture, right? This is not just a theoretical question right now. There are state services, state grants on the line. In Hanson, they turned it down and they lost their ability to apply for a library grant. A lot of infrastructure funding is now being tied to MBTA communities. So it's not a question without consequences. Right now, the SJC took this up recently, and they seem to be really focused on whether the guidelines that Charlie Baker's administration put into effect comply with the law or met the requirements for administrative procedure law and how that you would put regulations or guidelines into effect. So we'll see what happens there. My concern is that there's a lot of misinformation about it. In Pembroke, it was easy for us to comply because we had a zone that met with our housing production plan. In Pembroke, it's a little more difficult. Your group that has been working on MBTA communities has sort of satisfied more than half of the requirement, at Island Creek, which is already built out and unlikely to be built out further because it doesn't make a lot of economic sense. Remember, this was a deregulation plan and let the private market take over. The private market is going to build where it makes sense to build. They're not going to tear something down just to build a few more units. The more difficult question is at Bonji's. And the issue at Bonji's is it going to be a 40B if it's not built under 3A? In my mind, under 3A, you have a lot, I've been through a lot of site plan review on the planning board. You do have stormwater management review, you have traffic studies, you have septic review, you have a lot of limiting factors on what can actually be built. And when you have a 40B project, the state takes a heavier hand with respect to those, what the town is allowed to enforce and not enforce. So that's where I come down to it being a difficult issue in Duxbury.
So one part I will agree on is that the selectmen and the leadership in Duxbury and in all of our towns are in a tough spot. And I really sympathize. I know we have Selectman Brian Glennon over here. And I don't envy his position one bit. I can tell you that, Brian. Because their job is to administer the budget and make sure that our towns are funded. A town like Duxbury takes advantage of a lot of those grants. All our towns do. But I don't think that's an excuse for what this law is trying to do. MBTA zoning is flat out would change the character of our town. And what was just described about these zones, like what they did in Pembroke by basically overlaying their zone on already built apartments and industrial parks, all the towns are trying to do. They're just skirting the law because even the people that are trying to comply don't want it. Nobody wants it. Republican, Democrat, unenrolled alike. Every select board has said, well, we don't like it, but we have to comply or else. You see what's happening in Milton and in other communities. And unfortunately, they've done a lot of really good work over at the Hanson Library trying to build up that and support the senior center as well. And it's really sad to see that they're going to lose that funding now. And that's not right. We need someone who's going to stand up and say, no, this is not okay. And we shouldn't have to bend backwards just to make sure that we comply when you have statewide officials like the Attorney General suing our towns with our tax dollars that are defending themselves with our tax dollars. It doesn't make any sense. The zoning doesn't make any sense for our towns. We already lack the infrastructure. When there was a big drought in Pembroke, specifically 2 years ago in 22, they had days where you basically couldn't use your water during certain times of the day. The infrastructure is lacking here to really accommodate any other housing supply on a large scale. That's why I think something small like ADU is still acceptable. And the deregulation, I don't really care if the deregulation is helping these giant developers putting in 15 units per acre. That's not right to me. That's not right. The towns need to have a say in that to make sure that their character is preserved.
Awesome. Yeah, the recent influx of migrant families to Massachusetts has put a strain on our emergency family shelter system. State officials recently added new shelter capacity limits and tightened access. Some critics say these steps are cruel and contrary to the state's right to shelter law. Others say they do not go far enough and the state just can't afford to continue to foot the bill. Where do you come down and what do you think the legislature should do to address this issue?
Thank you, Jack. That I would say with affordability, like I said, top two issue that I hear every day on doors at every event, every person who's concerned. The immigration issue is a very, very big problem. We're fortunate here in the 6th Plymouth that we're not getting hit with some of these unfunded costs because we have no hotels, we have no migrant housing, but our neighbors in Rockland and Kingston do. So they have those unfunded costs that come to the towns in the Commonwealth, increased police calls, increased fire calls, students that are being put into the schools without any warning, an influx of students that happened in Kingston and then they just showed up for school. So a big, big problem there. So definitely we're not going far enough. The big problem with this issue is the solutions have already been offered. We've tried repeatedly for years and bipartisanship as well. Senator Vellis, a Democratic senator as well, who was in the National Guard and was mobilized when some of these hotels started to fill up, offered residency requirements as a solution. So bar none, we need a residency requirement, whatever it is, 6 months, 9 months, a year, to make sure that Massachusetts residents, our elderly, homeless, people with mental health issues, veterans, they should not be due with these 9-month stipulated max stays that they're trying to enforce now. So if a new family arrives and we're at the 7,500 family capacity that Governor Healy initially instituted, that means someone from 9 months ago that could have been a veteran or a family that had a no-fault eviction in whatever town around here, and now a new arrival that's a non-resident gets to have that housing. So it's a really big problem. And beyond that, because this isn't about inflammatory rhetoric, and what Jack alluded to at the last part is this is a math problem. This is $1 billion a year last year, and we've already started our new fiscal year where another $1 billion was allocated. It is simply unsustainable. That number is out of control. Never mind the unknown cost that I previously mentioned that goes to our towns, medical, and everything else. This is unsustainable, and there needs to be an aggressive approach.
One of the things I find when I'm on the doors and I spend time to sort of sit down and really talk with people is that they don't understand how this happened. And part of how it happened and became such a huge cost was that the federal government failed on multiple levels. There was a bipartisan bill to fix this in large part, and it got killed in February. And if that had not gotten killed, we wouldn't be in this position right now. One of the things that this bill did that nobody talks about is that it changed the time period for work permits. When people say that people are coming in and taking shelter and taking housing, I don't know that everyone realizes you're given temporary status in this country when you come in on a political asylum claim, but you're given no legal right to work. You're brought into this country with no legal right to work. Right now, the law says that you can't even apply for the right to work for 180 days after you make your application for asylum. And then it was taking up to 9 months to approve those work permits. So when someone comes in with a family and has no ability to work for 1.5 years, that's a problem. The federal government that controls our border should pay for the cost of the consequences of their border policy. This should not be a state against state issue. The only reason why right to shelter has some impact here is because it may encourage people to come here instead of another state. If the federal government was doing their job, we would make a decision, and I think we would give work authorizations more quickly. Right now, the bipartisan border bill would have reduced it from 180 to 90. The Biden administration and the Healy administrations have been working very hard to bring the 9-month approval process down to 2 months, so that now you're more in the range of 4 to 5 months where someone can't work. But we need to make it so that people can get to work quickly. We're lucky to be in a low unemployment state where we have a lot of small businesses and a lot of people who can't afford to hire workers, who need workers. And we have people sitting in shelters legally unable to work. And if they work, they get deported and they don't qualify where their asylum application gets thrown out. So we need to fix this. Federal government needs to fix it. We need to put pressure on the federal government to fix it. And that's going to happen after November 5th.
Please name one elected leader of the opposite party you admire, either nationally or locally, and explain why. Becky?
So I guess when I say this right now, it's kind of difficult. We live in such a fractured country that it's very difficult. So when I think about it, I think of John McCain, who was always a Republican who I said, if I could, look past some policy differences, he's somebody I could have supported, because when people started with rhetoric about President Obama not being from this country, he was the only one who had the guts to say, no, that's misinformation. And that's not what we want to do here. He was really willing to speak out against misinformation. He was willing to support the Affordable Care Act because he knew it was a way to bring healthcare to so many people in this country. He had integrity. He served our country. He served our country honorably. He stayed in a POW camp when he could have been released, but he would have had to leave his fellow prisoners of war behind. He was someone with integrity. He was someone who, even back then, I said, McCain is a good option. I'm not afraid of what happens in this presidential election because McCain is a good option. He's a good person with integrity. So that's who I would pick.
It's a good answer. We can say that. Mine would be state auditor, DiZoglio. She has done an incredible job. She has cut through the partisan politics. She was a member of the legislature, both in the House and the Senate, and is not afraid to go back and say that her former colleagues are not up to snuff. They're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. I don't know if we're going to cover question 1 later. Are we? No? Okay. Well, I was just making sure I wasn't putting the carriage in front of the horse here. But question 1, which relates to auditing the legislature, which is being spearheaded by the auditor, is such a great ballot question. The polling is out of this world. Some have it up by 40 or 50 points. I don't know if anyone's ever agreed on anything more, and the legislature is petrified of it. And if that doesn't open your eyes to what's going on up on Beacon Hill, I don't know what does. So I really respect that she's able to look her former colleagues in the eye and say, you know what, I think we need to crack the books open on you guys and see what's been going on up there. She recognizes that this state is one of the least transparent and least accountable state houses in the country. There's a big problem with non-disclosure agreements for sitting representatives up there, and she's taken that head on as well. So I really, really applaud her for getting beyond the partisan politics, and that's really what we need to see more of. So I have great respect for Auditor DiZoglio as well, and encourage everybody to vote yes on 1.
All right, Ken. We are now down to question number 12. This set of questions relates to how you will embark upon this new role and fill the shoes of Josh Cutler. And as you can imagine in this room, we all think those are pretty big shoes to fill.
Yes.
How would you, as a new member of the legislature, make an impact on Beacon Hill? What would be the 3 committees that you would request and why? And what ideas do you have to deliver resources back to our district? And if you get answering and you need me to read that again, I'm happy to.
Okay, I think I got all 8 parts. So no, I agree. If it's too bad he's not here, but I thank Rep. Cutler for his time and congratulate him on his promotion. That's only going to help the 6th Plymouth, of course, particularly in the workforce development area, where VOTEC is such a big issue. I really look forward to partnering with former Rep. Cutler on that and seeing that expand and making sure that our skilled labor force grows in the state, because that's a big issue. As far as what I need to do to get up there, I think that you saw what Rep. Cutler did was build relationships across the aisle. So I'm actually really proud. Sorry, I'm really putting you on blast, Brian, but Selectman Glennon endorsed Josh 2 years ago against myself, and this year he's endorsing me, and I think that's sort of shows the type of representative that I want to be. I have Democrats, Republicans, and unenrolled from across the district endorsing my candidacy because they see me as the reasonable, bringing people together type of candidate. They know I want to go up there and make change and make sure that we're bringing money back and make sure that we're keeping up with our constituent services, which was actually a hallmark of Rep. Cutler's office. So there's a lot of dynamics to this. It's not just a voting record. It's a lot of different things. So to keep up on things that have been good, that have been going on, and to improve and make sure that, everything wasn't perfect and make sure that we improve and actually represent the voice here as much as we can. So as far as committees, I've got a lot of background in public safety, of course. So that's one I'd really like to take a hard look at the police reform bill that passed in 2020. I think there's some really common sense revisions that we can do. That bill was kind of passed without the stakeholders at the table. So I think there's a couple common sense things that can be done there. Economic development, which I served on as well in Hanson, and family having a small business, of course. Everyone wants to be on Ways and Means. That's a really important one. And what people don't realize as well is, going up in the super minority party can often be a really, really good thing. All the Republicans get money back to their district. So this fallacy that Republicans can't get money back to their district is just not true. And what's good about that is there's only about 25 of us. So I'll be in leadership a little bit more quickly than my Democratic counterpart. So there's a lot of work that we can do up there. And I really look forward to what opportunities kind of come. Sorry for going a little over with that one. So
That's fine. Becky,
So
you want me to read it again?
no, that's okay. So I've known Representative Cutler for many years. We've raised our kids together and we've had a law firm together, and I most recently worked for him up at the State House on the Committee for Labor and Workforce Development. He's given me a lot of advice over the years, a lot of insight in as to how he was able to manage to bring so much back to the district. And part of that is relationships. I've been working on building my own relationships over the last 21 years. I've worked in government in multiple towns. I'm president of the Old Colony Planning Council, so I've built relationships regionally around issues like water supply. There's a lot of relationships that I've built with my endorsement from Congressman Keating, even at the federal level. And I feel like these are relationships that are going to allow me, as they did with the Pembroke Community Center, to bring back some significant money. We brought $3 million in from Congressman Keating to help us build the Pembroke Community Center. So I've actually done the work. I've built the relationships. I know how to do that. By working at the State House, I also started to see how the State House works. So I feel like I have a running start on how to be in the building and how to build relationships within that building. First thing I would do that's easy to get on is the Coastal Caucus. Josh started something called the Coastal Caucus. Kathy Lenatra is currently chairing it. It's all of the legislators who have coastline in their district. And it's a way to build coalitions around issues like beach access and erosion control and money back for coastal resiliency. So I would start there. In terms of committees, I was on the Labor and Workforce Development Committee. I'm currently on leave as counsel to that committee. So I think it would make sense for me to work on a lot of workforce development issues where we're dealing with things like apprenticeships and making sure that we don't lose a trained workforce going into the future. But I also care a lot about the Education Committee, and I have a background in telecom, so I would also welcome the ability to be useful. I find that the more useful you are at the State House, the more able you are to build relationships and build coalitions to get things done for your district. That's
Thank you, everyone. Glad you came. Martha.
They get closing statements, I'm sorry.
Oh,
We're inviting the candidates to give us 3-minute closing
that's
statements.
an excellent idea. Thank you.
Okay, you go first.
Well, I went first on the beginning, so I think Ken can go first.
Yeah, thank you, everybody, again at the library here, everybody for attending, my opponent as well. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's always good when we can get together and talk about the issues. Being informed of this election is very, very important. I'm going to use 3 minutes is a good amount of time, so I'm going to just touch on a couple issues that we didn't really get to talk about tonight. I briefly talked about VOTEC access. That's a really big issue in this district. Duxbury doesn't have VOTEC access. Pembroke's looking to join South Shore VOTEC. That's something that's well worth the money. I'm really looking forward to making sure that our towns have that access because there needs to be alternatives to college preparatory programming here in the district. That's for one. Beach access is a big one. I think I mentioned early on, Save Duxbury Beach is doing a lot of great work here. There's been some, again, overregulation, very common theme here in the Commonwealth, that a state agency has arbitrary regulations against some seabird species that is preventing the legacy of recreation here in Duxbury. It's negatively affecting our economy. And what the agency's doing with the leased turns on the beach is not actually protecting the species at all. So there's a lot of things that need to be done here in Duxbury as well. Water infrastructure, not just the contamination, is really big. You have brown water that perpetrates in Pembroke all the time. That's going to be a really big issue. The state needs to step in there specifically because, again, the towns have a really hard time coming up with these large capital expenditures. I've demonstrated that, we have some policy differences. I believe we want the best for this district. There's just different ways to go about it. And I think the philosophical, excuse me, I didn't go to Duxbury schools. That's why I messed it up. The philosophical differences are really important here. So I believe that everybody in this room is better off when you decide what to do with your money, not the government. I believe our businesses are better off when regulation is low and they run it how they want to. And the towns are better off when the state government stays out of their business as well. So that's a key philosophical difference that we have. And I think that's very important. I'm glad to have earned the endorsement from a lot of people in the district. I'm the only candidate in this race that has an endorsement from a select person in every single town in the district. I have over 50% of the selectmen have endorsed me, including the entire Pembroke Select Board, on which my opponent formerly served. So I'm very proud of that work as well. And I just think that that bipartisan nature of Republicans, Democrats, unenrolled will serve me well now and in the future. And I really hope that everybody, no matter who you're going to support, gets out to vote on or before November 5th. So thank you again, everybody.
So before I go into my piece, I'll just invite you guys to look at Pembroke Connect Uncensored and get a sense of the Pembroke Select Board. It's not exactly a bipartisan board. In terms of my own reason for doing this, I have a tremendous amount of professional experience. I have been supported by 3 members of your own select board. I've been supported by business leaders, chamber leaders, like Peter Brown and Andrew Sullivan, and people in Pembroke who have helped to build our chamber and our business community in Pembroke. I've been on the board of directors of the South Shore Women's Business Network. I've worked with small business owners. I've helped them buy businesses. I have been a small business owner. I understand what it's like to be in business. Early in my career, I spent the first 10 years helping as part of a team to build the world's first private international satellite company. I also worked on a coastal engineering firm, post-disaster recovery relief, as I said earlier, and I've worked in personal law as well. I've done a lot of legal work. I've done a lot of town work. I've been on the Old Colony Planning Council working tirelessly for these communities. And I think that when it comes to government, it's not about hating government. It's about making government work for us. And sometimes it works for us when we work it, when we actually spend the time. And I've spent a lot of time. I've joined, my opponent has been at maybe 17 meetings. I've been at about 400 as a sitting member of a committee or a board. I've spent the time to get to know these issues intimately and to be ready to work for you and make government work for you and for us to strengthen our communities and not tear them down. Thank you.
Thank you. You all.
They took the new one. High in the sky.
Ken and Becky for spending time with us and talking with us about these issues. We really appreciate your input. And to our panelists, Jack, Donna, and Betsy, for your efforts here. So I encourage anyone who'd like to speak with Ken and Becky to come forward and talk to them individually if you have questions. Again, glad you came.